Florida has a problem worth over $2 trillion, and if its solution fails, large parts of the state will become uninhabitable. Today, more than 22 million people live on a low-lying peninsula, a paradise built on a swamp. They work, live, and build futures on land that is kept dry by a single sprawling and aging system of drainage canals, and that system is now failing. For decades, the ground beneath their feet has been sinking as the ocean around them has been rising. Now, the water is starting to win. The state's response has been a multi-billion-dollar engineering blitz, raising roads, installing massive pumps, and building sea walls. A desperate attempt to hold back the water. But here's what the glossy brochures and the political speeches don't tell you. The greatest threat isn't the flooding you can see. It is coming from below, from the ground itself. The very system built to drain Florida is becoming a highway for the ocean to invade from underground, poisoning the drinking water for millions. And no pump, no matter how powerful, can stop it. So the real question is, can Florida engineer its way out of a crisis that is woven into its very geology? Or did they just build the world's most beautiful and expensive city on land that is destined to return to the sea? What is the first image that comes to mind when you hear the word Florida? Let us know your thoughts down in the comments. A huge number of people who watch these deep dive analyses forget one crucial step. If you believe this kind of reporting is vital, then you have to hit that subscribe button. It is the single most important signal you can send that these stories need to be told. Don't be one of the viewers we lose. Subscribe now. You won't regret it. Let's begin. Florida was never meant to be paved. Before the concrete, before the theme parks, before the endless stretches of suburbia, most of South Florida was a single, massive, moving body of water. The Everglades, a slow-moving river of grass, 50 miles wide, flowing south from Lake Okeechobee to the Florida Bay. It was a landscape of cypress domes, sawgrass marshes, and mangrove forests, governed by the rhythm of wet and dry seasons. It was not land in the conventional sense. It was a wetland, an ecosystem perfectly adapted to a world of constant saturation. By any rational measure, this was a place to be respected, to be navigated, but never to be conquered. And yet, conquering it became an American obsession. The dream began in the late 19th century. Visionaries, or perhaps madmen, looked at the vast swamp and saw something else entirely. They saw farmland, they saw cities, they saw potential locked away beneath a shallow sheet of water. In the 1920s, developers like Carl Fisher dredged sand from the bottom of Biscayne Bay to create Miami Beach, an entire city conjured from the seafloor. But the real transformation, the event that forever altered the state's DNA, came after World War II. Soldiers who had trained under the Florida sun returned, bringing their families with them. The population boomed. Air conditioning defeated the oppressive humidity, and the American dream demanded a house, a lawn, and a place in the sun. The swamp stood in the way. So, in 1948, the United States Congress authorized one of the most ambitious civil engineering projects in human history, the Central and Southern Florida Flood Control Project, or the CNSF. The plan was audacious in its simplicity: to drain the swamp completely. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers arrived with dredgers, with dynamite, with a mandate to bend the landscape to human will. Over the next 2 decades, they constructed a breathtaking network of infrastructure. 2,000 miles of canals, 1,500 miles of levees and berms, hundreds of pumping stations and water control structures. They carved up the Everglades, straightened the Kissimmee River, and surrounded Lake Okeechobee with a giant earthen wall. It was an act of geological warfare. The goal was to capture seasonal floodwaters and, most critically, to get rainwater off the land and out to the ocean as quickly as humanly possible. The system worked on a simple principle: gravity. Most of the canals were designed to be lower than the surrounding land. Water, following the path of least resistance, would flow into the canals and be channeled east to the Atlantic or west to the Gulf of Mexico. It was an elegant, brutally effective solution. It worked. It allowed for the creation of modern Florida. The state's population exploded from under 3 million in 1950 to over 22 million today. $1 trillion in real estate was built on the newly dry land. Paradise was paved, but the CNSF was built with a single, fatal assumption: that the ocean would stay where it was. It did not. It never did. The system was designed for a world that no longer exists. Its engineers planned for rain. They planned for floods. They did not plan for the ocean to start pushing back. The first signs that something was fundamentally wrong were subtle, almost bizarre. They called it sunny day flooding. In neighborhoods miles from the coast, on perfectly clear days with no rain in the forecast, water would begin to bubble up from the storm drains. Streets would turn into shallow canals. Salt water, not rainwater. For a few hours, during the highest tides of the year, the ocean was literally flowing backward through the city's drainage pipes. The system designed to push water out was now ushering it in. Thinking about this, what do you think is a bigger threat? A hurricane you can see coming from days away, or the slow, silent creep of the ocean coming up from underground? Let us know your thoughts. By the early 2000s, what was once a rare curiosity became a recurring nuisance. Today, it is a predictable part of life in coastal Florida. In Miami, the number of annual tidal flood days has increased by over 400% since the year 2000. In some areas, residents check tide charts before leaving for work, knowing certain roads will be impassable. The economic cost is no longer theoretical. A few inches of salt water can ruin a car's engine. It can shut down businesses. It can corrode the foundations of buildings from below. The problem is gravity, or rather, the loss of its power. The old drainage system relied on the land being significantly higher than the sea. With just a few inches of sea level rise, that differential shrinks. During high tides, especially king tides, when the sun and moon's gravitational pulls align, the sea level can be temporarily higher than the elevation of the drainage outfalls. Water can no longer flow out. Worse, it flows in. The entire system stalls. For a few hours, a multi-billion-dollar network of 20th century concrete becomes useless. A relic from a more stable climate. This wasn't just a glitch, it was a warning, a sign that the foundational mechanics of Florida's survival were starting to fail. The problem wasn't just the pipes, it was the planet, and the water wasn't just coming from the tide, it was coming from the sky, in volumes the old system was never built to handle. If the sunny day floods were a quiet warning, the rain bombs are a violent assault. The same atmospheric warming that is causing the oceans to rise is also supercharging the water cycle. Hotter air holds more moisture. And when that moisture is released, it is released with an intensity that past generations never experienced. Meteorologists have a name for it: rain bombs, storms that drop biblical amounts of rain in a matter of hours, not days. The drainage canals of South Florida, dug 70 years ago, were sized based on historical rainfall data from the 1940s and 50s. They were designed to handle a steady, predictable flow. They were not designed for 20 inches of rain in 12 hours. The city of Fort Lauderdale discovered this in April of 2023. A series of thunderstorms stalled over the city. It wasn't a hurricane. It wasn't even a named tropical storm. It was just rain. A relentless, suffocating downpour. Official gauges recorded over 25 inches of rain in a 24-hour period, a 1,000-year rainfall event. The city's drainage system, a complex web of pipes and canals, was instantly and completely overwhelmed. It wasn't that the system was broken, it was that the sheer volume of water was mathematically impossible for it to handle. The pipes were too small, the canals were too shallow, gravity was too slow. If you found this breakdown valuable so far, please do us a solid and hit that like button. And if you know anyone who lives in a coastal area or has family there, share this with them. This isn't just a Florida problem. This is a story about every coastline on Earth. Water poured into the streets with nowhere to go. The airport was forced to close, its runways submerged. Cars were abandoned as roads turned into rivers. Homes that had never flooded before took on feet of water. For 2 days, large parts of a modern American city were simply paralyzed. They'd held hostage by a volume of water its own infrastructure could no longer manage. The event exposed a terrifying new reality. The standards of the past are no longer relevant. The engineering that made Florida possible is now dangerously undersized for the climate of the 21st century. The city was built for a different world, and that failure wasn't just happening at the surface. Deep underground, a far more insidious crisis was unfolding. A threat not to property, but to life itself. This is the emergency that nobody wants to discuss. It's not about wet streets or flooded homes. It's about the water you drink. Beneath South Florida lies the Biscayne Aquifer. It is not an underground lake. It is a vast, porous layer of limestone, like a giant sponge, holding trillions of gallons of fresh water. And that it is the sole source of drinking water for over 6 million people. And it is being deliberately and systematically poisoned by the very canals built to protect the region. The process is called saltwater intrusion. It is simple, relentless, and almost impossible to stop. Remember, those canals were dug deep into the earth to promote drainage. In doing so, they cut directly into the porous limestone of the aquifer. For decades, as long as freshwater levels in the Everglades and the aquifer were high, pressure kept the saltwater from the ocean at bay, miles offshore. But the draining of the Everglades lowered that freshwater pressure. At the same time, sea level rise increased the pressure from the ocean. Saltwater, being denser than freshwater, began to push inland, not just at the coast, but underground. And the canals became the perfect conduits for this invasion. Unlined and cut deep, they act like straws, allowing the heavier saltwater to plunge downwards and contaminate the freshwater layers of the aquifer. The salt line, the boundary between fresh and saltwater, is monitored obsessively by hydrologists, and for 80 years it has been moving in only one direction, inland. In some areas, it has advanced more than 5 miles, rendering wells unusable and forcing municipalities to abandon entire well fields and drill new ones further west, at enormous expense. They are in a race against geology. Every time they retreat, the salt front follows. This is the existential flaw in Florida's design. The system that keeps the surface dry is the same system contaminating the water supply below. It is a slow-motion catastrophe, unfolding in complete darkness, hundreds of feet beneath the glistening towers of Miami. And there's another factor: subsidence. The original swamp soil of the Everglades was rich in peat, an organic material. When the Army Corps of Engineers drained the land, that peat dried out, compacted, and oxidized. It simply vanished. The ground level itself began to sink. In some agricultural areas, the land has dropped by more than 6 feet since the 1920s. So while sea levels are rising, the land itself is sinking. It is a two-front war, and Florida is losing on both fronts. The elevation difference that gravity requires is vanishing, millimeter by millimeter, every single year. I know we mentioned it before, and I'm sure you're thinking, not again, but a staggering number of you watching this right now are not subscribed. If we're going to keep funding these deep, independent investigations into the critical failures happening all around us, we need your direct support. It takes exactly 1 second, and it ensures we can keep making them. Please, take that second and hit subscribe. It matters more than you know. Faced with a system on the verge of total failure, Florida is doing what it has always done. It is trying to engineer its way out. The scale of the response is breathtaking, matched only by its cost. Across South Florida, a frantic, multi-billion-dollar effort is underway to upgrade the state's antique plumbing. The price tag is almost beyond comprehension. Miami-Dade County alone estimates it will need more than $6 billion over the next 20 years. Statewide, some projections put the cost of adapting to sea level rise at over $75 billion by 2040. To put that number in perspective, it is more than the entire annual budget of most U.S. states, all to keep the water at bay. The projects themselves are a strange mix of brute force and simple ingenuity. In Miami Beach, they are physically raising the roads. Entire street grids are being lifted by 2 to 3 feet. It's a surreal sight. Gleaming new roads that slope steeply down to the doorways of older buildings, sidewalks that end in a sudden drop. It is a visible, concrete admission that the original elevation of the city is no longer viable. Then there are the valves. At the end of thousands of drainage pipes, crews are installing one-way check valves, often called duckbill valves. These flexible rubber tubes allow rainwater to flow out, but when the tide pushes back, the pressure flattens the bill, sealing the pipe and preventing salt water from flowing in. It's a simple, effective solution for tidal backflow. But the most dramatic change is the move away from gravity. Where water can no longer drain on its own, the state is turning to brute force. Massive new pumping stations are being built, capable of moving hundreds of millions of gallons of water per day. During a flood, these pumps roar to life, sucking water out of the overwhelmed canals and firing it out into the bay. It is a war of energy against water. An admission that the passive system of the 20th century has failed. These pumps are engineering marvels, but they are also incredibly expensive to build and operate. Admit it, they consume enormous amounts of electricity, much of it generated by fossil fuels. Florida is, in effect, burning carbon to fight a problem caused by carbon emissions, a feedback loop with a terrifying cost. And every dollar spent on these pumps, these roads, these valves, is a dollar that comes from somewhere. It comes from taxes. It comes from bonds. It comes from rising fees for residents who are paying more and more just to keep their heads above water. The state is buying time. But the uncomfortable question no one can answer is, what are they buying it for? And is it even enough? This is the part of the story that the engineers and politicians rarely mention in public. The new solutions, the billions in pumps and raised roads, are designed to fight the water you can see. The floods from rain, the tidal surges from the sea. And they do absolutely nothing to stop the water coming from below. The ground itself is becoming the source of the flood. Because South Florida is built on porous limestone, rising sea levels don't just push against the coast, they push inland, underground, raising the entire water table. The freshwater lens that floats atop the denser saltwater is being lifted from beneath. In many low-lying areas, the water table is now just a foot or two below the surface. After a heavy rain, the ground becomes saturated almost instantly. The water has nowhere to drain because the sponge is already full. Even worse, as the water table continues to rise, it will eventually break the surface. Permanently. This is the endgame that no pump can fix. Entire neighborhoods will experience constant, blue sky flooding not from the sky or the sea, but from the ground up. You cannot build a wall against water that is already on your side of the wall. You cannot pump away an ocean that is pushing up beneath your feet. Hydrologists from the U.S. Geological Survey have modeled this process. Their maps show that with just 1 to 2 feet of sea level rise, which is well within scientific projections for the coming decades, large inland areas of South Florida will become untenable, not because of storm surge, but because of a permanently elevated water table. Septic tanks will fail. Building foundations will be constantly saturated and begin to corrode. Tree roots will rot in the saltwater-laced soil. This is the true existential threat, the point at which the land itself becomes fundamentally uninhabitable. The multi-billion-dollar infrastructure projects are a response to the symptoms. They are a treatment for the fever, but they do nothing to cure the underlying disease. And that disease is geology. It is the simple, unforgiving fact that this land was once a swamp, and the water is coming to reclaim it. The consequences of this slow-motion breakdown are no longer abstract. They are real, and they are escalating. The most immediate is the implosion of the Florida insurance market. For decades, affordable property insurance was the lubricant that kept the real estate engine running. That era is over. Since 2017, more than a dozen private insurers have pulled out of the state entirely, declaring the risk of catastrophic loss to be unmanageable. The remaining companies are raising rates by 40, 50, even 100% in a single year. Homeowners who have paid off their mortgages are facing insurance bills of $10,000 or $20,000 a year. Many are being forced to go bare, dropping insurance altogether. A home that is uninsurable is a home that cannot be mortgaged. It is an asset whose value is effectively zero. This isn't a storm hitting. This is a financial hurricane making landfall every single day. Then there is the human cost. A new and cruel form of social stratification is emerging. Climate gentrification. As low-lying areas become riskier and more expensive, wealthier residents are moving to higher ground. Neighborhoods like Little Haiti in Miami, historically a working-class